It is just past noon on a Tuesday in July, and somewhere inside a brightly lit department store, a 6-year-old boy is about to vanish in front of dozens of witnesses, in broad daylight, less than 50 feet from a police station window. No one will see it happen. No one will hear a scream. And by the time anyone realizes he is truly gone, the trail will already be going cold. What happened to him over the next 16 days would force an entire country to ask a question it had never seriously asked before. How do you protect a child when the system meant to find them does not even exist yet? Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because stories like this remind us that truth can be stranger than fiction. Now let's step back into that store, because to understand how a boy could disappear in front of a police station in the middle of the day, you first have to understand who he was, and how ordinary that Tuesday morning felt right up until the moment it stopped being ordinary at all. His name was Adam. Adam John Walsh, born in the autumn of 1974, the only child of a young couple building a life that looked, from the outside, almost impossibly perfect. By the summer of 1981 he was 6 years old, barely 3.5 feet tall, with sandy blonde hair and hazel eyes and a face full of freckles that made grown adults smile without even meaning to. He loved baseball. He loved drawing pictures at the kitchen table while cartoons played in the background. And he was shy. Not shy in the way children sometimes perform shyness for attention, but quietly, genuinely shy, the kind of child who needed a few minutes alone with a stranger before he would offer them so much as a smile. Hold on to that detail. It will matter more than you can possibly imagine right now. His father, John Walsh, was a rising hotel executive, deep into a multi-million-dollar development project in Miami, the kind of man who built things with his bare hands and his ambition both. His mother, Reve, was a part-time student and a competitive bodybuilder, a woman shaping her own identity even as she poured herself into raising her son. They lived in Hollywood, Florida, in a house that looked, to anyone driving past it, like proof that the American dream still worked exactly the way it was supposed to. And on the morning of July the 27th, 1981, nothing about that house, or that family, or that day suggested that anything was about to go wrong. A family friend stopped by early that morning, as he often did, but he could not take Adam along to a work shoot that day. Too windy out on the water, he said. So at 11 o'clock that morning, Reve buckled her son into the car for two simple errands. A quick stop to register him for the upcoming school year. And then a short drive to the Sears at the Hollywood Mall, where a lamp she had been eyeing for months had finally gone on sale. It should have been the most forgettable afternoon of the summer. They walked through the doors together, and almost immediately, Adam's eyes found something far more exciting than a sale on lamps. A brand new video game console, sitting on display, glowing under the store lights, a small crowd of boys already gathered around it taking turns. In 1981, this was not just a toy. This was a piece of the future, sitting right there in the middle of a department store, and Adam wanted nothing more than to be part of it. Reve did what any careful, loving parent would do. She looked around. Security guards walking the floor. Staff behind every counter. Shoppers in every direction. And just outside the windows, visible from where she stood, the police station sat directly across the street. It was noon. It was daylight. It was, by every reasonable measure, one of the safest places a parent could leave a child for a few minutes. She told Adam she would be just a few aisles over, in the lamp section. He looked up at her, said okay, and turned back to the screen. She walked away. What happened in the minutes that followed would haunt her for the rest of her life, and it would take 27 years, and the collapse of countless leads, and the quiet confession of a dying man, before anyone could even begin to explain it. The lamp, it turned out, was not in stock. The salesperson who might have helped her was out to lunch. Reve left her name and number, and turned to walk back toward the toy department, expecting to find her son exactly where she had left him. 10 minutes. Maybe 15 at the most. That was all the time that had passed. But when she rounded the corner into the toy department, something was wrong. The console was still on, the screen still glowing, but the small crowd of boys that had surrounded it minutes earlier was gone. All of them. Every single boy who had been standing there was simply, inexplicably, no longer there. And neither was Adam. At first, she told herself it was nothing. Children wander. They get distracted. He had probably followed the other boys to look at something else, some new display, some toy 2 aisles over. She called his name, calmly at first, then less calmly, walking the aisles, checking the corners, the restrooms, anywhere a 6-year-old might have drifted off to. Nothing. She went to customer service, and asked them to make an announcement over the store intercom. A flat, disembodied voice echoed through the building. "Adam Walsh, please come to the front of the store." Nothing happened. A second announcement went out, the same voice, just slightly less certain now. "Adam Walsh, please come to customer service." Still nothing. By the third announcement, something had shifted in the air of that store, something almost impossible to describe unless you have lived through it yourself. The ordinary background noise of a department store, the hum of fluorescent lights, the rustle of shopping bags, seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a single, sinking realization that was beginning to settle over every person within earshot. Shoppers who had been browsing quietly moments earlier now stood frozen near the registers, watching a mother's face change in real time. Employees stopped restocking shelves. A few people who had no connection to the Walsh family at all suddenly found themselves walking toward the exits, scanning the parking lot out of some instinct they could not quite explain. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a public place when everyone in it begins to sense, all at once, that something irreversible has already happened, even before anyone says the word out loud. This was not a child who had wandered 2 aisles over. What none of them knew yet, what would not come to light for almost 3 decades, was that the truth was even worse than what Reve feared in that moment. And the people responsible for that truth were standing inside that very building. Roughly 15 minutes after Reve had walked toward the lamp section, an argument had broken out at that video game console. A handful of boys, disagreeing over whose turn it was to play. A teenage security guard, barely out of high school herself, working part-time, with absolutely no training for handling a dispute involving small children, was called over to deal with it. She did the only thing she knew to do. She split the children into 2 groups, and walked them toward 2 separate exits. One group went out through the doors they had originally come in through, the very same doors near where Reve had parked her car. The other group was walked out through a side exit, into an entirely different section of the parking lot. A part of the building Adam had never laid eyes on in his life. By every account that would eventually surface, years later, Adam was placed in the second group. A deeply shy 6-year-old boy, suddenly standing alone in an unfamiliar parking lot, separated from the one door his mother might still have been able to see him through, and according to witnesses, he did not argue. He did not protest. He simply went where he was told, because that is what shy, well-behaved 6-year-old boys do when an adult tells them to move. And in that single, almost invisible decision, made by an untrained teenager trying to settle a squabble over a video game, the entire trajectory of a family's life was quietly, irreversibly altered. It would be nearly 2 hours before Hollywood police were even called. 2 hours, in a store with a police station visible through its own front windows. And when an officer finally did arrive, and John Walsh came racing in from his office in Miami, frantic, terrified, the first words out of that officer's mouth were almost unbearable to imagine now. "Slow down," he reportedly told John. "Most kids just wander off. They walk home by themselves." John's response came back instantly, sharp with disbelief. "This is a 6-year-old. We live 5 miles from here. He has never walked anywhere alone in his entire life." The next morning, a local newspaper would quote a police spokesperson suggesting that kidnapping was not suspected, that the boy was probably just lost. As if a 6-year-old child could somehow navigate 5 miles of South Florida highway, alone, in the middle of summer. What none of them understood yet, what no one could have understood yet, was that the country itself was not built to handle what was happening to this family. There was no nationwide alert system in 1981. No instant network connecting police departments across state lines. No federal database that automatically logged a missing child the moment a parent reported one. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was legally prohibited from stepping in unless there was solid evidence that a state line had been crossed, or unless an actual ransom demand had been made. A missing 6-year-old, in the eyes of the system, was simply a local problem, to be handled by whichever small department happened to have jurisdiction. John Walsh would later confront a coroner about why Adam's case had not been checked against unidentified remains elsewhere in the state, only to discover the coroner did not even know the relevant national database existed. "We put a man on the moon," John said, "and you are telling me I have to call every coroner in Florida myself just to find out if my son is dead?" The coroner had no answer for him. So John and Reve did the only thing left to them. They moved into the police station, and they did not leave for 2 weeks. They built their own telephone tap in case a ransom call ever came. They printed and distributed roughly 500,000 flyers with Adam's photograph on them. They watched the reward climb, $5,000, then 10, then far higher, eventually settling somewhere near $120,000, an amount worth well over $1/3 today. Volunteers combed fields. Helicopters traced the coastline. Truck drivers passed word back and forth over their radios, up and down the highway, night after night. Reve barely slept those first 2 weeks. She has spoken, in the years since, about lying awake at the station thinking of small, almost unbearable details. His feet would be cold. He only had on the clothes he had worn that morning. He hated being away from home after dark. These were not the thoughts of someone preparing for the worst. They were the thoughts of a mother still trying, against everything her instincts were telling her, to believe her son was simply lost somewhere out there, frightened but alive, waiting to be found. And while all of that desperate, exhausting search was unfolding, something was happening 120 miles to the north that none of them yet knew about. 16 days after Adam disappeared, on the night of August the 10th, 2 men were fishing near a drainage canal off the Florida Turnpike. It was nearly dark. And in the water, drifting just beneath the surface, they saw something pale and round that, for one merciful, fleeting second, they convinced themselves was a child's discarded doll. It was not a doll. The very next morning, John and Reve were scheduled to appear live on national television, pleading with the country to help them find their son. They sat under studio lights, in front of cameras, in front of millions of viewers, begging for information. 120 miles away, investigators were already making an identification. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story, because what comes next only gets darker, and the truth behind this case is far more disturbing than anything we have told you so far. The identification, when it came, left no real room for doubt. Dental records matched. A close family friend recognized a small, unmistakable detail, a gap in the boy's front teeth, a new tooth just beginning to grow in behind it. Years later, advanced testing on a small fragment of bone would confirm what everyone already feared, matching directly back to Reve herself. The medical examiner's findings were delivered with the cold, clinical precision that only makes a tragedy like this harder to absorb. Blunt trauma. A fractured nose. A cause of death that made one thing devastatingly clear. Based on the condition of the remains, Adam had likely died within a day or two of vanishing from that store. There had never been a kidnapper waiting for a payoff. There had never been a ransom to negotiate. Whoever had taken him had never intended to let him come home. John and Reve held a funeral. There was no body to bury, not yet, because what remained of their son was still considered evidence in an active investigation. They stood over an empty casket and buried their child in name only, while somewhere else entirely, the search for the person responsible was only just beginning. In the days that followed, the medical examiner pulled John aside and told him something that would quietly reshape the rest of his life. There was nothing more anyone could do for Adam now. But there was something John could still do. Something that would mean his son's death was not simply the end of a story, but the beginning of a different one entirely. Make sure he did not die for nothing. Those words would eventually lead John Walsh to help build an entire national infrastructure for finding missing children, the kind of system that, tragically, had not existed in time to save his own son. But that story, the story of what John Walsh would go on to build, was still years away. First, the people responsible for finding Adam's killer had to actually do their jobs. And what followed next would turn out to be one of the most catastrophically mishandled murder investigations in modern American history. Statistically, when a child is murdered, investigators know the uncomfortable truth. The person responsible is most often someone close to the family, not a stranger. So detectives began exactly where they were trained to begin. With the people who loved Adam the most. John and Reve both agreed to polygraph examinations. Both passed, with no deception detected. Then there was the family friend who had been staying with them for years, the one who had stopped by that very morning, the one who had moved out of the house just 2 weeks before Adam vanished. When investigators dug further, they discovered something the Walshes had not made public. He had been involved in an ongoing affair with Reve for several years. His first polygraph came back inconclusive. He appeared visibly shaken under questioning. His second test cleared him. He underwent hypnosis as part of the investigation. Eventually, he was ruled out entirely, and the Walsh family themselves never once believed he had anything to do with their son's death. But Hollywood police did not let go of that theory easily. They pursued it with an intensity that, looking back, bordered on obsession, consuming an enormous amount of time and resources that could have gone toward other leads. One officer later admitted, on the record, that they had pushed every legal boundary in pursuing that man. "We did everything short of beating him," the officer said. Out of roughly 10,000 pages eventually compiled in the case file, a staggering portion of those early critical weeks were spent chasing a theory that ultimately went nowhere. And while that theory consumed the investigation, whatever real trail still existed outside that house was growing colder by the day. 2 years later, just before a legal deadline would have closed the door on it forever, John and Reve made the difficult decision to sue Sears for negligence, arguing that an enticing, unsupervised display had drawn their son in, and that an untrained employee's split-second decision to send him out the wrong door had directly led to his death. Sears, in response, argued that Reve herself bore responsibility for leaving her son unattended in the first place. And then, in a move that still feels almost unthinkably cold, the company signaled it intended to drag every private detail of the family's life into open court, including the affair. When Sears moved to subpoena the active police files as part of that lawsuit, threatening to expose investigative material that could derail any future criminal prosecution, John and Reve made the only choice they felt they could. They dropped the case entirely. There was a much larger fight ahead of them, and they were not going to let a corporate legal team turn their son's murder into a courtroom spectacle. There is something quietly devastating about that decision, when you sit with it for a moment. A family that had already lost everything was forced to choose, all over again, between accountability and protection, between making someone answer for what happened to their son and simply protecting whatever fragments of privacy and dignity they still had left. They chose protection. And the company that may have played a role in setting those final, fatal minutes into motion was never made to answer for it in open court. Over the years that followed, name after name moved through the investigation. Most were eliminated almost immediately. A few, however, are worth understanding, because they show just how chaotic, and at times almost unbelievable, this case became. One man, already in custody for abducting a different child around the same period, had a cellmate who claimed he had confessed to killing Adam. Investigators searched his vehicle, tested for blood evidence, and found nothing conclusive. His work records placed him elsewhere that day. He was cleared. Another man, later imprisoned for an entirely separate and extremely violent attack, began bragging to other inmates that he had killed Adam Walsh. Decades later, he voluntarily gave investigators a DNA sample. It did not match. He eventually admitted he had only said it to make himself sound more dangerous behind bars. There had never been any truth to it at all. And then, in 1991, a name surfaced that sent a chill through the entire country. When Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested in Milwaukee, and the full, horrifying scope of what he had done became public knowledge, people who had lived in Hollywood, Florida back in the summer of 1981 began coming forward with their own memories. Dahmer, it turned out, actually had been in South Florida that summer. He had been discharged from the army that spring, found himself broke, sleeping on beaches, before eventually landing work at a local sandwich shop that operated a delivery van matching a description given by witnesses near the Sears that very day. Several of those witnesses, when shown photographs side by side of Dahmer and another man investigators had been circling for years, pointed to Dahmer. Not the other man. Dahmer. Dahmer denied it outright. If he had done it, he told investigators, he would say so. He claimed he would welcome the death penalty rather than hide a crime he had actually committed. And there is something deeply unsettling about that claim, because by that point, Dahmer was confessing to an extensive list of other murders in exhaustive, voluntary, almost methodical detail. He seemed to feel no need to hide any of it. So why would he lie about this one? Except, Dahmer was also a man capable of years of sustained, calculated deception toward the people closest to him. A man who had hidden the unthinkable from his own family for years without a single crack in his composure. He left Florida roughly a month after Adam disappeared. He was never charged in connection with this case. And the question of his possible involvement was never definitively settled. It was simply overtaken, swallowed up, by what happened next. 2 years after Adam's murder, in October of 1983, a television movie based on his disappearance aired on national television. Nearly 40 million people watched it that night. At the very end of the broadcast, photographs of other missing children flashed across the screen, one after another, a quiet, desperate appeal to anyone watching who might recognize a face. The very next morning, a detective in a nearby Florida county received a phone call that would finally begin to crack this case open. The man on the other end of that call was already familiar to investigators. He was, in fact, the very same suspect whose photograph had been placed beside Dahmer's, the one several witnesses had passed over in favor of identifying Dahmer instead. His name was Otis Toole, a drifter with a long, disturbing history of arson, already sitting on death row for an entirely separate murder, already serving multiple life sentences layered on top of each other. And now, for the very first time, he was confessing to killing Adam Walsh. But almost immediately, his story began to fall apart at the seams. Toole and his longtime partner, a man named Henry Lee Lucas, were already infamous within law enforcement circles as serial false confessors. Two men who, between them, had claimed responsibility for hundreds of murders across more than a dozen states, almost always in exchange for what investigators bitterly nicknamed fried chicken and field trips. Time outside a prison cell. A hot meal. A car ride to point investigators toward a supposed burial site that, more often than not, led nowhere. Toole's first confession contained serious, glaring problems. He described Adam wearing clothing that did not match what he had actually been wearing that day. He named Henry Lee Lucas as his accomplice, except investigators quickly discovered that Lucas had been sitting in a Maryland jail cell on the exact day Adam disappeared, nowhere near Florida at all. When confronted with that contradiction, Toole simply shifted his story without hesitation. He had done it alone, he said now. He had only lied about Lucas being involved. It would have been easy, at that point, for investigators to dismiss him entirely as just another attention-seeking false confessor. But alongside all of those inconsistencies, there were details that were far harder to explain away. The number and pattern of the wounds matched the autopsy findings almost exactly. The position in which the remains had been discovered matched what he described. He spoke of driving north along the turnpike, and described a specific wooden footbridge near the exact location where the body had been found. A detail that, as far as investigators could determine, had never once been made public. And his own personal timeline placed him, unaccountably, somewhere in South Florida during the precise window when Adam vanished. Investigators eventually tracked down a vehicle Toole said he had been driving that summer, a car he had since lost through a repossession. When officers tested the interior using a chemical that reveals blood traces invisible to the naked eye, both the front and rear floorboards lit up immediately under the light. They photographed the inside of that vehicle extensively. Nearly 100 separate images, by some accounts. And in at least one of those photographs, taken of the carpet directly behind the driver's seat, something in the glowing blood pattern appeared, almost impossibly, to resemble the faint outline of a small child's face. Those photographs were never developed. They sat completely forgotten, buried somewhere in an evidence locker, for almost 25 years. It would take a private investigator, hired by the Walsh family themselves in 2008, to finally be the first person to lay eyes on them properly. By then, the carpet itself, the one piece of physical evidence that modern DNA testing could have used to settle this case beyond any possible argument, had already been physically cut out of the vehicle and tagged for collection. And then, simply, never collected. The car was eventually sold for scrap years later. The carpet vanished along with it, not stolen, not destroyed in some dramatic fire, but simply lost, sitting forgotten in storage somewhere in Florida while the investigation's attention drifted elsewhere entirely. The machete believed to have been the weapon suffered an almost identical fate, its forensic value quietly degraded past the point of any usable testing, decades before the kind of DNA technology that might have made real use of it ever existed. Toole died in prison in 1996, still serving time for his other crimes, without ever once standing trial for what he had done to Adam Walsh. For more than a decade after that, the case remained, officially, unsolved. Not because every lead had dried up, but because the original investigation had been so thoroughly compromised, so badly mishandled from those very first hours, that there was barely anything coherent left to build a prosecution on. It would take until 2008, 27 years after that ordinary Tuesday morning at Sears, for Hollywood police, after a renewed review prompted largely by the Walsh family's own privately funded investigation, to finally and formally close the case, naming Otis Toole as the man responsible. By then, Toole had already been dead for 12 years. There would be no trial. No jury. No single moment of legal accountability in the way most people imagine justice arriving. Only, finally, an official acknowledgement of something that had likely been true for a very long time, arriving decades too late for it to feel like anything close to victory. Standing before cameras after nearly 30 years of waiting, John Walsh said something that, more than anything else in this entire story, captures exactly what that wait had cost him. For 27 years, he said, we have been asking who could take a 6-year-old boy and do this to him. We needed to know. And now, finally, we know. But knowing, even after 27 years, does not undo what was lost in those first few critical hours. A boy sent out the wrong door by an untrained teenager. A corporation that chose silence over disclosure to protect itself from liability. A police department that took the better part of an hour to cross a single street. A country with no real system in place to search for a missing child at all. And evidence, the one piece of evidence that could have proven everything beyond doubt, left sitting forgotten in storage for 25 years until a grieving family had to spend their own money just to go looking for it themselves. Adam Walsh would be in his 50s now, had he lived. Instead, his name became something else entirely. A symbol of everything this country did not yet know how to do to protect its own children. And, slowly, painfully, over decades, a symbol of everything it eventually built, because one set of parents refused to let their son's death simply disappear into a system that had already failed him once. Think, for a moment, about how ordinary that Tuesday morning felt right up until it wasn't. A mother checking off 2 simple errands. A boy excited about a video game. A few minutes in a lamp aisle that should have meant nothing at all. That is, perhaps, the most haunting part of this entire case. There was no warning. No sense of danger in the air. Just an ordinary day, in an ordinary store, that quietly, irreversibly, became the last ordinary day that family would ever know. Somewhere, even now, that small department store still stands, the same brand of fluorescent lights still humming overhead, shoppers walking past a toy aisle without the faintest idea of what once happened there on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in July. And somewhere in the quiet space between a mother's 10 minutes in a lamp aisle, and a teenager's split-second decision at a side door, an entire family's future was rewritten forever, in a way that no amount of time, or justice, or answers, could ever fully repair. Perhaps that is the real, lingering question this case leaves behind, long after the headlines faded and the cameras moved on. Not simply who could do something so unthinkable to a child, but how many ordinary, forgettable decisions, made by ordinary people on an ordinary day, have to align in exactly the wrong way before an entire family's future is quietly, permanently rewritten. If this story shocked you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. There are many more unbelievable true stories waiting for you here.